August of 1948. Central Idaho. Chamberlain Basin. A small aircraft crosses the ridgeline above the Salmon River drainage and levels out above a high mountain valley. From the cargo hold, a wooden box tumbles away from the fuselage. A parachute snaps open above it. The box swings in the thin air, drops toward the tree canopy at the edge of a mountain meadow, and hits the ground hard enough to trigger the latch. The latch opens. One beaver walks out. If Elmo Heter got his calculations right, the animal would be shaken but alive, find water within a day, and begin doing what beavers do. This was 1948, when the roads into this country barely existed, and the navigation tools that would make a mission like this routine were decades away. Elmo Heter was a wildlife manager for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. He had designed a parachute crate capable of delivering a live beaver from a small aircraft to a mountain meadow. He had tested it enough times to be reasonably confident the design held. He was now preparing to use it on 75 more animals. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. But I wanted to see what those 76 beavers had built in the 76 years since that morning. So I went looking for their dams. It was the early 1940s, and the beaver situation across Idaho's roadless backcountry had been quietly falling apart for the better part of a century. The fur trade had worked through the American West with methodical efficiency. By the time the market for beaver pelts collapsed in the mid-1800s, the accessible drainages had been largely cleared out. Streams within a day's ride of a road or a settlement had lost most of their beaver populations in the previous generation. What remained in the remote country was a fraction of what the land had once held. The problem facing Idaho's wildlife managers by the 1940s was not simply one of overall numbers. It was geography. Beavers were being relocated off agricultural land regularly, pulled from areas where they were flooding irrigation ditches and causing problems for ranchers, and moved to new sites. That part of the work functioned well enough. But the drainages that needed beavers most, the high-elevation wilderness drainages where the land was going dry and cutting deeper into its own banks without them, were beyond what any existing method could reach. You cannot drive a truck into Chamberlain Basin. You could not in 1948, and you still largely cannot. Getting there means landing a small aircraft on a rough backcountry strip, or riding in on horseback across 2 or 3 days of mountain terrain. Pack train relocation had been tried. The survival rates were poor. Beavers under sustained stress and heat don't do well, and a multi-day summer pack trip through the mountains is exactly the kind of sustained stress that kills them before they reach the release site. Elmo Heter had tried these methods. He had watched the results, and he had started thinking about the problem differently. The box itself was straightforward. A wooden crate, modified to carry a single beaver cushioned in packed vegetable fiber, designed to absorb landing impact. A parachute rigged to the outside. A latch on the front calibrated to release when the box hit solid ground. Before deploying the system at scale, Heter needed to know it worked. The Fish and Game crew acquired a test beaver. They named him Geronimo. Geronimo was loaded into the crate and dropped from a small aircraft over a suitable landing zone. The box opened. Geronimo walked out uninjured. The crew retrieved him and ran the test again. By Heter's own account in the report he published afterward, by the 3rd or 4th drop, Geronimo had developed a routine. When the crew approached after each landing, he would walk back into the crate on his own, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid on Geronimo's part. Possibly both. The kind of number that makes you reconsider what willing participant means in field research. Once the testing was complete, Heter moved to deployment. Summer and fall of 1948. 76 beavers total. Loaded into modified crates, rigged to surplus military parachutes, dropped from small aircraft into the Chamberlain Basin drainage and surrounding wilderness country. That was August of 1948. Heter published his findings in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 1950. The paper described the method, the survival rates, and the early evidence that animals were establishing at the drop sites. By the early 1960s, beaver sign in those drainages had expanded well beyond where the original drops had landed. And then the Idaho Department of Fish and Game made the decision that mattered as much as the drops themselves. They left the drainages alone. No intensive follow-up management, no active monitoring that would bring disturbance into the recovery zone. The animals were placed. The land had the rest. What the 1950 paper couldn't capture was what happens to a watershed when you give it back what it lost, and then step away for a human lifetime. A beaver colony does not build one dam. A pair establishing in a new drainage will put a dam in, let the pond fill and stabilize, and if conditions support it, extend territory upstream. As the colony grows across generations, they work their way further into the drainage, building a sequence of impoundments that stair-step up the valley floor. Each pond backs water into the surrounding soil. The water table rises in the meadow ground on either side of the channel. Willows move in along the edges first, because willows are water seekers, and a raised water table through July and August is exactly the condition they need. Aspen follow the willows, pushing up wherever the table stays high enough through the summer dry period. Then the sediment dynamics shift. Fast water carries what slow water cannot. The silt and fine gravel that had been washing downstream through an incised, fast-moving channel begin dropping in the stilled water behind each dam. The stream bed that had been cutting down into its own banks starts building back up. Gravel bars appear. The channel widens and stabilizes at a new elevation. Fish respond to the change. Trout need cold, clear water and gravel beds for spawning. A beaver pond system lowers summer water temperatures through shading and reduced flow velocity, and the fine sediment that would otherwise choke a spawning riffle drops out in the still water above the dam, leaving clean gravel downstream where the fish need it. The birds follow the willows. Moose move into the water and the willow thickets. Elk and deer use the meadows that stay green 3 and 4 weeks longer than the surrounding slopes, because the water table beneath them doesn't drop in August the way it did before the ponds were in place. This cascade does not require management once it begins. No one instructs the willows to grow in wet soil. No one tells the trout where the gravel is. The engineer of all of it is the beaver, building for its own purposes, producing conditions that everything else in the system has been waiting on. If you want to follow more of these recoveries, subscribe. I put one up every couple of weeks. And if there's a place near you that came back, I'd like to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. By the 1980s, the Chamberlain Basin drainage had been building beaver wetlands for more than 30 years. When I came into the country in 2024, I was looking for what 3 decades of that kind of work produces. The layered record that accumulates in a drainage where colonies have been active across multiple generations. What I found was not subtle. The pond systems and drainages that historical records describe as having been without beaver before 1948 showed clear evidence of generational use. Old dam cores with new material added on top. Breach points that had been repaired more than once. The older repair visible as a slightly different material and angle from the newer one. Standing snags in the flooded zones. Bleached timber rising out of still water. The signature of a pond that has been in place long enough to kill the trees it drowned decades ago. The meadows told the same story. In a drainage with long-established beaver ponds, the vegetation line shifts. The boundary between wet soil plants and dry soil plants moves back from the channel, sometimes 20 feet, sometimes more, depending on how long the water table has been elevated. That line is not subtle. You can see it from a ridge above the valley. Where the green runs wide across the valley floor in August, when everything on the surrounding slopes has cured to brown, something has been holding the water table up for a long time. I walked through those meadows in August of 2024. The green ran wide. and above the meadows in the channels, feeding them from higher elevation, I found the dams. In the most active sections I covered, 3 and 4 impoundments stair-stepped up the gradient, each one backing water into the one downstream. Exactly the pattern you get when a colony has been working a drainage for generations rather than seasons. I didn't try to trace which colonies descended directly from Heter's 76. Beaver populations don't stay where they're placed. They expand, die back in hard winters, recolonize from different directions. But the drainages those animals were dropped into in 1948 had become source habitat for this entire region. Whatever was building in those canyons in 2024 had its origins in a set of wooden boxes and a surplus parachute. And that wasn't even the part I found hardest to account for when I started looking at what those drainages connect to. The Chamberlain Basin drainage sits inside what became the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in 1980. Roughly 2.3 million acres of central Idaho, the largest contiguous roadless wilderness in the lower 48 states. The drainages Heter targeted in 1948 are protected inside it. And those drainages feed the Salmon River. The Salmon River is one of the most important salmon and steelhead rivers remaining in the Pacific Northwest. The cold, clean tributary flows from the high wilderness drainages are part of what makes the main river viable as a anadromous fish habitat. A drainage with active beaver pond systems moves water differently than a depleted one. Snowmelt that in an empty drainage runs off fast, peaking the stream in May and leaving it low and warm by August, moves through a beaver pond network on a slower schedule. The impoundments hold water. They release it through the dry months. Summer stream temperatures stay lower. Flow stays higher through the critical period when juvenile salmon and steelhead are in fresh water. The fire dimension compounds this further. Anyone who has spent time in Idaho backcountry has reason to think about fire behavior in mountain terrain. A wet drainage behaves differently when fire comes through than a dry one. The saturated ground around an active beaver pond stalls runs along drainage bottoms. Not in every fire, and not in the worst drought years, but a run that would otherwise race through a dry canyon can hesitate at the wet zone. I have watched fires in this country, and the wet draws are consistently where the runs slow down or stop. That is what 76 beavers, dropped from an aircraft in 1948, set in motion. A cascade that runs from dam construction to water table to willows to fish habitat to fire behavior to salmon downstream. Up to that point in the 1940s, the working assumption in wildlife management had been that restoring depleted populations to remote wilderness was impractical at the scale Idaho's backcountry required. The terrain was too vast, the access too difficult, the methods too unreliable. That assumption was overturned by a field worker with a wooden box and a surplus parachute. The same remoteness that made the problem nearly impossible to solve, the reason Heter had to invent the parachute method in the first place, turned out to be exactly what protected the recovery once it took hold. The drainages were too far from roads to attract the land use pressures that degraded more accessible habitat in the decades that followed. The restoration succeeded partly because of the very problem it was designed to solve. The decision to target the most remote and inaccessible country first seemed, at the time, like a logistical constraint. It wasn't. The animals were placed in terrain that would be permanently protected from development, grazing conversion, and timber harvest. The work those beavers started has been accumulating on protected land for 3 generations. There's a reason this story took decades to circulate outside of wildlife management circles. There was nothing to see from the outside. No dramatic event, no ceremony. A small plane flew over a mountain valley and dropped a wooden box, and what followed happened slowly, in roadless country, across the course of a human lifetime. The cascade was building while almost nobody was watching. By the time someone flew those drainages with a camera, the beaver work looked like it had always been there. That is how most genuine recoveries actually work. One careful step, then another, across years that are invisible from the outside, until the land announces itself. I've walked through a lot of mountain country that got written off, drainages that went dry after the beavers were trapped out, stream beds cutting down through their own banks, meadows curing brown by the end of June because nothing was holding the water table up, country that the people working it in the 1940s had stopped expecting anything from. Some of those drainages have beavers in them again now. Some do not. The ones that do look the way Chamberlain Basin looks in August. Ponds stair-stepping up the gradient. Snags in the flooded zones. Green meadow running wide across the valley floor. The ones that don't look the way a drainage looks when the animal that built it has been gone long enough that the land has given up holding water. I do not romanticize these recoveries. I have watched enough of them to know that some drainages take the animal back and some do not, and that the difference is not always something you can engineer in advance. Soil type, stream gradient, the depth of the original disturbance, all of these matter, and they are not always in your favor. But the Chamberlain Basin in 2024 is a record of what happens when the conditions are right, the land is protected, and someone was willing to try something unusual to get the animal back into country that needed it. Geronimo bore the brunt of the testing program. The watershed got the benefit of it. Heter tried something unusual. The land answered. The question that stays with me, driving through country that looks like those drainages looked in 1947, the year before Heter's plane flew over them, is not whether returning the builder works. The dams answer that. The question is what it costs us every year that we decide the problem is too remote to reach. Subscribe if you want to follow more of these stories. I come back with a new one every couple of weeks. And I'm curious, is there a stretch of ground near you that came back? A creek, a hillside, a piece of country that was written off and then surprised someone? Leave it in the comments. I read them.